Chapter 4. What Max Saw, in which Little Bo Peep loses his sheep, and Peter Piper picks a pickled pepper. Max Piper wasn't at all pleased when he went to bed that night in Squire Peep's grand mansion. They'd played well after dinner, as well as they ever had, but once again precious little Peter got all the accolades. Peter didn't deserve the praise, Max thought, and it wasn't just jealousy or an older brother's resentment that a younger one came along and stole all the attention. This was a matter of simple, unemotional logic. If 4 musicians played the same tune, but only one of them did it well, then the bad ones would ruin any effect the good one had. It stood to reason. It wasn't opinion, but the simple and impartial calculus of performance. No matter how wonderfully the good one played, it would still come out as a mad cacophony. But if their music did sound lovely and melodious, which it certainly had, it could only be because they'd all played well. Even Peter, he reluctantly had to admit. They all did a professional job of it, and no one should be singled out, except maybe Max, because he had the more difficult instrument to play. He played the large bass flute with its deep and resonant tones, because he was the only one big enough, well, at least tall and lanky enough to do it. His father was a short man, and Peter was still just a kid. Neither of them had a wide enough natural hand spread to cover all of the stops. Only Max's long, dexterous fingers were up to the daunting task. And yet it was Peter they loved and complimented, and all because father couldn't stop praising his younger son. He's the one who put the idea into everyone's minds. If father would just shut up for once and let their respective talents speak for themselves, then Max would be recognized as the true prodigy. Of that he was certain. It was a simple matter of logic. And not only that, Peter took the best berry tart for dessert. He could see Max had his eye on it, so just to be vindictive, the little stinker stole it right off the tray before it came around to Max. These were the thoughts that troubled Max's mind, going round and round, repeating once and again as he slowly drifted off into a fitful sleep. The sound of thunder woke him. Max could tell many things as he struggled into consciousness, but they were all a confused jumble in his head. He could hear the distant thunder, but there seemed to be too much of it, like it was the biggest of all storms. But it was also in a terrible hurry, one thump of thunder following right after another, with none of the usual breaks in between. It boomed in a steady rhythm, as if trying to get all of its crashing and pounding out as quickly as possible. And he smelled breakfast smells, so someone had thought to start cooking, and that was good, because if people were making breakfast, then things couldn't be too bad. No one thinks to cook when the world's coming to an end. Then again, he was almost certain he'd also heard screaming. His first cogent thought was to go to the window and see just what was what, but he also had an urgent need to pee, as he very naturally did every morning upon waking. He sat, frustrated for a moment, his pale and spindly bare legs hanging off the tall bed. Both possibilities seemed to require immediate attention. Since he couldn't decide to do one thing over the other, he compromised and did both. He grabbed the chamber pot from under the bed and took it with him, shuffling hurriedly over to the window in his nightshirt and his nightcap and his bare feet. Out in the road, not more than a stone's throw from the main house, and therefore from his own window, Max saw an invading army. They marched in ranks, 4 or 5 abreast, down the very same road his family had travelled the day before. First, in the vanguard, there were men on horseback, outfitted in iron armour overlaid with lacquers of midnight black and dusky gold and deep carnelian. Here there was a knight in armor all of green, and there was one in armor of white, decorated in twining blue flowers. And dozens more Max spied, wearing armor and surcoats and flowing cloaks of every color in the spectrum. They sat upon great chargers with barding that matched the riders. They wore plumed helmets and had long, heavy broadswords strapped to their belts. Behind the parade of knights came the color guard, more mounted soldiers but in uniform livery, carrying bright pennants, heralding numerous past victories. And then behind the flashing color guard, the rest of the cavalry rode their war horses and carried their long lances. Then there followed rank upon rank of foot soldiers, and these weren't even men at all. Shaped like men in only the crudest, most rudimentary way, they were huge, burly creatures with green, warty skin, black animal eyes, and long yellow tusks. They carried crude swords and axes and spears, some of which were still stained with the dried remains of something Max dared not contemplate. They wore armor of rough, undecorated iron, and it was the tramp, tramp, tramping of their iron boots, thousands of them marching all in unison, that Max had mistaken for thunder. The ranks of green-skinned horrors came on and on, a never-ending column that appeared from around the same bend in the road that he'd run down, carrying his discovered arrowhead. They were divided into different groups. A company of spearmen was followed by a company of pikes, and they were followed by a company of archers, all carrying quivers full of black-headed arrows on dark red shafts, Max intuited. But it didn't occur to Max just then to realize he'd been right all along about an incipient invasion, and that he was the only one who'd figured it out, that not even precious little Peter had understood what the arrowhead actually meant, while he had, and that everyone should have listened to him in the first place. That insight would come later. At the moment, Max could do nothing but gape in astonishment, watching the invaders come on and on in their endless ranks, while he stood there with his nightshirt pulled up around his chest, miserably pissing into his chamber pot. In an awful rush, Max dressed and ran downstairs to find the entire household engaged in a flurry of activity. One of the Peep daughters, he couldn't tell which, flew by him, scampering up the same stairs that he descended. She was bawling loudly and trailing 3 or 4 frightened and worried household maids in her wake. 2 of the hired hands, armed with pitchfork and hoe, were standing in the middle of the room, getting manure from their shoes all over one of the good rugs, loudly asking of nobody in particular, "Do we fight? Are we going to fight?" But no one answered them or seemed to pay them any attention whatsoever. Other servants were quickly gathering silver candlesticks from off the mantel and silver serving trays from off a sideboard. Whether to hide them from the invaders or steal them for themselves, Max couldn't guess. None of the other Peeps were present, nor any of his own family. Not knowing what else to do, Max grabbed one of the house servants by the sleeve as he tried to scurry by. It was someone he recognized, by the name of Kurt, if one of the adults or any of the Peep daughters spoke to him, but whom Max and Peter had to address as Mr. Morgan Schlaughton. He was fat, old and red-faced, and looked like he was about to burst something. He carried a small framed portrait painting of Mrs. Crescentia Peep in one hand and a paring knife in the other. What he planned to do with either of those items no one could tell, perhaps not even Morgan Schlaughton himself. "Where is everyone?" Max shouted. He hadn't intended to shout, but the army outside, combined with the chaos inside, made Max more frightened than he ever imagined he could be in a situation like this. He'd always pictured himself as cool and calm in an emergency, taking command, and of course he always had a sword in his hand. There was a set of decorative crossed swords mounted on the far wall, over an equally decorative console table, and he briefly wondered if he should go arm himself with one of them. Then, Morgenschlotten's insistent tugging at his hand, he still had hold of the man's sleeve, reminded him of his original intent, to find someone in charge. "Where's Squire Peep?" "He's in the kitchen, of course," Morgenschlotten snapped. "Now kindly unhand me, young man." Why in the kitchen? And why "of course"? Max knew nothing of the important matters of high men of status like the squire. Is the kitchen where all great men in command of great estates naturally go in times of crisis? Whatever for? To personally guard the pots and pans? Max could make no sense of the comment, but since he didn't know what else to do, and a man like Mr. Pepys certainly would know what he should do, Max headed for the kitchen. The kitchen wasn't a single room, but a complex of interconnected chambers that took up the entire west wing of the ground floor. In the main section, the part with all of the stoves and chopping blocks and such, Max saw all 3 cooks and both scullery maids working feverishly, preparing the breakfast Max had smelled earlier. Dozens of eggs were being boiled and broiled and fried in skillets, and in other skillets large slices of ham and fat sausages sizzled and popped. No sooner did one cook pull pans of just-baked biscuits out of the oven than another one put new pans of dough in right beside her. And there was oat mush and breakfast cakes and thick brown syrup in glass pitchers that were lowered into pots of bubbling water to warm them. All 5 women looked harried and upset. The head cook had tracks of recently shed tears down her white cheeks, and not one of them paused in their hurried efforts to shoo Max out of there, which is the very first time that ever happened, or more properly, didn't happen. No one seemed to mind his being there, or even notice that he was, which scared him as much as anything else had this morning. If that's changed, then everything has, Max thought, and he wasn't wrong. Through a large open archway on the far side of the room, Max saw the great wooden table where mixes were mixed and vegetables were chopped and diced and shucked and sorted, and where sometimes breakfast could be eaten in lieu of one of the more formal dining rooms. Additionally, it was where all of the household servants gathered to eat their dinner after the Peep family and their guests had been served elsewhere. This morning, the table was occupied by strangers. By their expensive military dress and their brusque, superior attitudes, Max surmised that they had to be officers of the invading army outside. There were 7 of them, and they sat all around the table, eating the breakfast that the cooks had made, more of which they continued to cook even now. Mr. Peep was in the room with them, not seated, but standing nearby, meekly nodding his head as one of the officers talked around successful mouthfuls of eggs and sausages. Max's father was also in the room, standing next to Mr. Peep and looking both grim and worried. "All of your lands are confiscated in the name of the Emperor," the officer said, "as are your houses, barns, stables, and any other structures." The officer was bald, with a fringe of short black hair around his ears and the back of his head. He had giant black mustachios that drooped past his chin before turning up again at the ends, which were waxed to sharp points. He wore a red and gold uniform jacket decorated with frills and tassels and medals and shiny brass buttons. "Your crops will be confiscated too, and your livestock slaughtered to feed my troops," he continued, spooning a fat dollop of honey onto a biscuit. "You will all be allowed to remain here for now. In fact, you are required to do so while we continue on to secure the town of Wesen." "Winson," Squire Peep corrected automatically, and then quickly shut his mouth and lowered his eyes as the officer shot him with an evil stare. "You'll stay here while we secure the town of Winson," the officer began again. "You'll work hard to bring in all of the remaining crops as quickly as you can. And mind you, I don't mean to suggest that you'll order your laborers to work hard while you oversee them. You're all of an equal status now. You and your fat wife and your skinny daughters and even your guests will toil in the fields along everyone else. In a few days, I'll send one of my officers from the Quartermaster Corps to collect the bounty and evaluate the quality of your compliance. This land and its people are now part of the Empire, and will be so forevermore." His voice was calm and low and nearly uninflected, as if he knew he'd never have to raise it to command anyone's rapt attention. His pronunciation, while precise, was heavily accented. "Whether you're fated to serve the Empire as slaves, or to be proudly numbered among its many free and loyal citizens, has yet to be decided, but will largely be determined by the manner in which you conduct yourselves over the next few days." "Yes, sir," Peep meekly said, and Max was astonished all over again. In all of their visits over the years, although Squire Peep was always jolly and pleasant, he was also unmistakably the man in charge. He told people what to do, and no one ever told him what to do, except for sometimes his wife did, but Max already understood how marriages involved a private exception to many rules. As far as Max had known, Squire Peep ran the entire county and everyone in it, and now here he was, nodding and bobbing his head at the behest of these terrible men. Max must have made a noise then, some small voicing of his surprise, because in the adjoining room his father suddenly looked his way, and transfixed Max with such a look as he'd never seen the man produce. No one else took notice of him. Peep continued bobbing his head while the officer kept issuing commands. Exactly what additional commands Max wasn't able to recall later, as his attention had shifted entirely to his father's intense regard. Never taking his eyes off Max, father slowly and carefully raised one finger to his lips, silently ordering Max to remain quiet. Then he whispered a quick word into Squire Peep's ear before excusing himself from the room full of foreign officers. No one moved to prevent his leaving. In fact, no one showed any sign that they cared what his father did one way or another. Father padded over to join Max in the other room. "What has happened?" Max said in a frantic whisper, pregnant with the future possibilities of panic and weeping. "Shh," Father also said in a whisper, but one under rigid control. "This isn't a time for you to talk or ask questions, son. It's a time for you to listen and obey. Your mother and brother are waiting for us in the great hall. That's where I want you to go to. If you see Mrs. Peep or any of the daughters on the way, take them to wait there with you. Don't go outside and don't talk to any of the soldiers. I don't think they'll hurt you as long as you stay quiet and stay out of their way." "What do we do once we're all there?" Max said. "Nothing. Just stay put and try to help keep everyone calm. Can I count on you to do that, son? This is one of those moments I've told you about, when you have to step up and be a man. Can you do that?" "Of course." "Good. I'm comforted to hear it, Max. So go do what I told you, and in a little while Mr. Peep and I will join you there and explain everything." Max obeyed. For the first time in a long time, he was pleased to do exactly what father told him to do. The great hall was full of unhappy people. Most of the indoors servants and all of the outside workers were crowded in there. Mother Piper was seated at one of the benches along the wall, and Peter stood beside her, trying to look brave, but mostly looking scared and uncertain. Mrs. Peep and all 6 of the daughters had also eventually arrived, reporting, as others had before them, that soldiers were all over the grounds and in the house. But for now, at least the invaders seemed content to leave them alone here in this chamber. The girls were oddly disarrayed in small ways. One had a splash of brown mud staining her yellow dress. Another had lost one shoe and was absently holding its mate in her hands and wouldn't let anyone take it from her, as if it was some sort of protective talisman. And the bratty little one who Peter liked sat directly on the cold flagstone floor, crying and sobbing with great racking sobs that shook her entire body. "They killed them," she cried. "All my little lambs, Gerda and Funny Applecoff, and Peter too." She'd gone through the list many times over and over again. Sometimes she'd be able to name every one of them. Max gathered that there were 7 or 8 in all, and at other times she'd only be able to get out 2 or 3 before the sobs claimed her again. She'd been at it for quite a while, resting between loud bouts of misery to regather her strength before starting again. Father promised Max he'd be along soon, but so far they'd been here for hours, waiting to learn their fate. True to his word, Max took it upon himself to be the strong and steadfast leader of his father's wishes and his own fanciful imagination, whose resolutely unflappable example kept panic from spreading to the troops. Max pictured himself a solid rock of calm assurance in the storm. He circulated time and again throughout the large room, going from one cluster of people to another, imploring them to refrain from fear and assuring them that his father and Squire Peep would come in no time to explain everything. The trouble was that Max wasn't actually all that calm himself. His voice betrayed considerable worry, and there was a wild and unsettled look in his eyes. And since while making his rounds he also tried to recall and report the grim things he'd overheard in the kitchen, which were anything but reassuring, he was generally more successful at reigniting fears than at settling them. From time to time, they could hear the muted sounds of the activities outside, as the detachment of the human officers and their goblin troops, for such were the green-skinned monsters called, which had broken off from the main column and fanned out over the property, corralled animals and put them to the sword, or the axe, or club, or whatever other weapon happened to be most handy. In one truly horrifying moment, they heard the pleading voices of the estate's stalking animals, begging not to be killed. "They've gotten into the talking stable!" Hans Scruft cried. He was the chief stable master, and therefore the one in charge of the so-called talking stable, where those magical animals with human language were lovingly housed and cared for. "Why would they kill them too?" "They're all just meat on the hoof to goblins," young Manfred said, his voice unusually bitter. "I saw a few gobs off a ship once, back when my family lived at the far seaport of Land's End. Makes no difference to a goblin if a beast can talk or not. Into the stew pot they go. And not just talking beasts. Did you happen to see early this morning, when Big Jurgen and Tiny Jurgen were both cut down in the fields? None of us quite knew what was occurring yet, and they just naturally resisted. You know how those two can get. Well, you can bet your last mark that they've also been stripped of their meat by now. Nothing but a few bones and red stain left of those two, because gobs take everything, the meat and guts, both, Gobs will eat anything that was once alive, even their own fallen comrades." "Bonnie Lumpin!" Peter cried from across the room. His eyes were filling with tears, building enough weight to go streaming down his face. "Your old mule's dead now, boy," Manfred said, "sliced and hanging in the gob cook's larder, ripening for mess." "Manfred Jacob Walder, you must stop that kind of talk this instant." Mrs. Peep was suddenly on her feet and as red-faced as anyone had ever seen her before. "Can't you see you're scaring us all over again? Think of the children." Manfred had his mouth open, about to say something else, but he shut it with a loud, wet smack of his lips and sat down abruptly, embarrassed and beginning to turn as red as Mrs. Peep. "Everyone should be quiet now until Father and the Squire arrive," Max called out. It was very good advice, and might have been heeded if Max had been older than his mere 14 years, hadn't been so trembling of voice, or had even a portion of the authoritative qualities he desperately imagined in himself. "You've been bleating that same tune for 3 or more hours, boy," another of the field hands said. His name was Willingham, and he was a big fellow, with a pudgy belly, but arms thick with real muscle. He had a long, ragged scar under one eye. "Put a stopper in it, before I do a little slicing of my own." In one hand, William held up an open jar of pickled vegetables he'd been passing around among a few of the men. Certainly he didn't plan to slice anyone with that, did he? But then Max noticed William's other hand, where he'd drawn his personal dining knife from his belt and held it down near his leg, not precisely hiding it, but not brandishing it either, the way some do who are hoping to avoid any actual knife play by making an opponent back down. Those who are serious about their deadly intentions don't need to make a big show of it. The knife's blade was only 5 or 6 inches long, but in Max's eyes it looked as bright and deadly as the biggest sword. Max was suddenly quite afraid, and it wasn't just the general fear he'd felt all day, when any of 100 different unspecified dooms could have befallen him. This was a very particular sort of fear, in response to a specific and immediate threat from a grown man right in front of him. All heroic fantasies vanished in an instant. Max wanted nothing so dearly as to run from the room, or worse, even more humiliating, into his mother's arms. And the shame of this immediate and fully potent fear hit him hard. The entire room could see him wilt like a flower. At that very moment, his spirit was on the threshold of being crushed for all time. And then, when it seemed there could be no greater humiliation than this, it suddenly increased tenfold. "You leave my brother alone!" Peter cried. He barged forward into the middle of the room and faced the large, scary William, as if he were ready to fight him on the spot. It was a comical sight, the small boy standing up to such a big man. First, William gaped at the surprising scene, and then he laughed a great roaring laugh, and soon nearly everyone in the room joined in. "You're quite the fierce young wolf," William said, a broad grin splitting his scarred face. "A warrior among men. Here, son, have a true man's treat. See if you have a taste for tough victuals." He held out the open jar to Peter, who just stood, quivering, but otherwise not doing anything in response. "Go on, try one, boy." The jar stayed there, suspended in front of Peter, looking less to Max like a peace offering, and more like some sort of mysteriously renewed threat every second. "It'll grow you some hair down there." Even Max understood that this was now a challenge his little brother must meet. Peter hesitated and then started to reach for the jar, ready to pull his hand back at an instant. "Hurry up, little warrior. Pick something. It won't bite. Well, it will, but not until you bite first, which seems only fair now, doesn't it?" More laughter, but quieter now, pensive as all waited to see what the little boy would do. All at once he seemed to screw up his courage. Peter picked a pickled pepper. He bit it hard and fast, and suddenly his eyes mushroomed with new tears and his nose blossomed bright red. His face scrunched into a mask of anxiety and regret, and then he began coughing and sputtering. Tears flowed freely and snot ran down his lip. Wilhelm and his mates exploded with renewed laughter. "And look at that!" Wilhelm shouted. "He didn't even spit it out!" Which was true. Peter grimly chewed the pepper and swallowed it, his face a study in agony all the while. "You're a better man than I am, young hero. Even I don't eat the little red ones. We call them dragon's warts for good reason. They keep too much of their fire. I just eat around those." Wilhelm gave weeping, coughing Peter a huge slap on his back, the kind that said, "You're our friend now and equal to any of us." And that broke the last remnants of the spell of danger in the room. Max had stood to one side during this tableau, quite forgotten by all in the chamber, which was a blessing, considering what might have happened before his little brother bravely intervened. But if so, it was a miserable blessing indeed. Once again Peter was the hero, and Max was nothing at all. But one thing saved him. Before he could sink into that final abyss of despair, the one so deep that no man could ever fully escape, Max noticed something that made him angry, very angry indeed. He'd missed it at first, because as usual Peter was dressed in a shirt and breeches of simple brown homespun, whose color almost exactly matched the shade of the thing hanging across his back. It was a narrow tube of hard leather, just over a foot long, and attached to a strap at both ends, which was looped crosswise over Peter's back, over one shoulder and under the other. Once he actually saw the thing, Max recognized it instantly. Peter was carrying Frost. "Give that here!" Max shouted, startling all into stunned silence. Peter faced him, as did everyone else in the room. "Max?" Peter said, an authentically worried expression on his tear-stained face, his eyes still watering from the harsh pepper. "What's the matter?" "You're carrying Father's flute. That's not right. If Father doesn't have it, then I should be the one to hold it for him. You can't keep it safe. I'm the oldest, and he put me in charge." Max's face was twisted with anger, as if Peter had done something personally to hurt him. He held out his hand. "So give it to me." "No, Max, you don't understand. It isn't Father's flute anymore. Last night he gave Frost to me." "Liar!" Max screamed. "He did," Peter said. "I know you wanted it, and I always thought you'd be the one to get it, but Father decided otherwise." "He wouldn't do that. I'm the oldest. I'm the one who gets Frost and not you. You're just a big fat liar and a thief." "But Max, you are! You've always been a thief, and you always will be. You steal everything from me and take everything that should be mine, but you won't get away with it this time. Give Frost back to me." Max threw himself at Peter and hit him, first once and then again. Peter staggered back, shocked into immobility. Like all brothers, Peter and Max had had their squabbles, but it had never before turned violent. Max had never hit Peter in the past, and he could hardly believe he was doing it now. Some detached part of Max realized he was out of control, but he couldn't help it. His face was a contorted mask of rage, and there was madness in his eyes. He lunged at Peter wildly, hitting, scratching, and clawing at him, screaming, "Give it back!" All the while, Peter fell to the floor, curling up and covering his face with his arms. Max dropped on top of him, continuing to claw and scratch, and now also biting. He bit Peter in the fleshy part of one arm, and when he moved it out of danger, Max tried to bite Peter's newly exposed face and neck. By now, Max's screams had degenerated into an incoherent wailing of pure agony. And then, all at once, Max felt himself levitating into the air, still flailing madly, but no longer able to reach Peter. Big Wilhelm had lifted Max off his brother. Wilhelm held Max suspended in one huge hand, preventing him from doing anything but striking and clawing at the empty air and wail his frustration. Mother Piper was also standing there, looking angry and hurt. "What are you doing, you daft child?" Mother said. "Are you insane that you'd start a fight in the middle of an invasion, where any sort of trouble is liable to inspire goblin monsters to come in here to chop us dead?" Max only answered her with continued wailing. "He's not a rational creature no more," Wilhelm said, and then he shook Max vigorously, still up in the air, trying to shake all of the fight and struggle out of him. "I think his mind's broken. I've seen it happen to others like this, back in my army days. They just get too afraid and something snaps inside them." Max continued to struggle in Wilhelm's arms, but weaker than before. Wilhelm shook him again, as a terrier will shake a rat caught in its mouth to snap its neck, or at least shake the fight out of it. "That's enough, I think," Mother said. "Please set my son down." Max no longer looked mad, just stunned and confused. "I don't know, ma'am. He might still have some wildness in him." "Do as she says, Wilhelm," Mrs. Peep said. Sometime during the ugly spectacle, she'd also stepped up to the front ranks of the ring of spectators surrounding Max, Peter, and Wilhelm. The other daughters were there beside her, dumbstruck by the scene, except Bo, who knelt by Peter, still lying on the floor. "Are you hurt, Peter?" Bo said, and she looked genuinely concerned. With a grunt of disgust, Wilhelm tossed Max away from him, which wasn't quite what Mrs. Peep ordered, but which was more compliance than he desired to give. Without quite getting up off the floor, Max scuttled over to sit against one wall, where he curled in on himself, still not quite sure what had happened, how he'd let himself lose control as he had. He sat and brooded and wondered at the profound injustice of this incident. Peter had clearly caused it, but Max would surely be the one who was blamed. "My intention," Mr. Peep said in a booming voice, "and I believe my instructions bore this out, was that you would all assemble in this hall and wait quietly, giving our new visitors no provocation to do further harm. And now here we find you whining and squabbling like schoolboys during recess." Radolf Peep had arrived sometime while everyone's attention was diverted by the fight. Johannes Piper was with him, looking as disappointed as the squire. "Peter stole Frost," Max said from over against the wall. He sat with his knees up and his arms across them, so that only his eyes and his tangled mop of hair peeked out from within his wall of protection. He sulked and steeped in the certainty of his unwarranted suffering. The entire world conspired in these terrible betrayals against Max. "We'll talk of that later," Johannes said. "For now, we've more urgent worries to attend to. Everyone here should listen to the squire." And they did. Much of the stress and concern that had filled the room just moments before, and which had manifested itself into fights and bullying japes and angry snapping at each other, faded, because here was someone who'd always commanded their respect and who could possibly provide answers where only terrible fears occupied their minds. Bo Peep sat in the middle of the floor, comforting Peter, petting him, in fact, as though he were one of her lost lambs.
"It seems we've fallen under the dominion of a great and brutal empire,"
Radolf Peep said.
"But I, for one, don't enjoy the prospect of spending the rest of my life in bondage to a foreign dictator. Do you?"
There were a few mumbles of agreement here and there, but most in the room seemed to realize it was a rhetorical question.
"Most of the army has moved on, marching towards Winson town,"
Peep continued,
"and I believe the immediate danger has moved on with them. This humble estate was not the main target of their intentions today, but a few have been left behind, no doubt to ensure that we adapt quickly and meekly to our new lives. But almost due west of us, as the crow flies, is the river Weser, and on that river is Hamlin town, which is walled like a great fortress and garrisoned with many companies of the king's good men. We can bet that mighty Hamlin town hasn't fallen to these scoundrels, who seem content to march along these lesser roads and take smaller unfortified towns like Winson. I don't know what you plan to do, but Johannes Piper and I have decided to take our families out of here tonight when our new guards are asleep and make our way to Hamlin."
"How?" someone said.
"The roads will certainly be watched." "We won't be taking the roads. We are going to cut across country."
"Enter the Black Forest at night?" another field hand said. "That's madness."
"Yes, it's a foolish act. Only the mad or truly desperate would venture into the greater haunted depths of the wood, far off the safe paths that we've managed to carve out and tame over the generations with our patrols of armed men and spells of warding. But who's more desperate than we, who have a choice between the woods tonight or more of this army tomorrow? Would you like to know how we're going to do it?"
There were immediate nods and grunts of assent.
"Ariane, watch that door,"
Peep said to one of his daughters, while pointing to one of the sets of doors leading out of the room.
"And Dorothy, you watch the other one. Just crack them open enough to peer out and make sure no soldiers are lurking within earshot."
And then Squire Peep spoke for a long time, and slowly a bold plan took shape, and it began to dawn on Max that their daring scheme would afford him many opportunities to set a few things aright.